We all knew we were going to Vietnam.
It was the game changer, I think.
And the mission it flew, although dangerous, was exhilarating.
We'd get in all-day battles, we'd get in half-day battles.
The Air Cavalry Troop was a unique organization, unique to the entire Army.
The first sergeant took me out and pointed to y'all's hooch and said, "That's the Outcasts, don't go down there." I said, "I think it's un-American to fight a war without booze."
When you're 19, 20 years old, you're bulletproof. Nobody's really thinking much about the real dangers that we're about to face.
Our engagements were very, very close. They were man-to-man. They were extremely personal. And the other guys that are here today are all guys who have covered me in combat.
A warrant officer in the United States Army from 1968 to 1973.
I spent 25 years in the military. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, scout pilot, Cobra pilot.
Crew chief on an OH-6 from 1968 to 1970, 2 tours in Southeast Asia.
Nearly 7 years. Captain, I flew AH-1G Cobras, UH-1s, OH-6 Alphas, OH-58s.
Came into the service in October of '66 and was separated in February of '72. Flying AH-1Gs, UH-1s.
I enlisted in the Army in 1969 and served in the Army till 1973. A year's tour in Vietnam, flying the OH-6 Alpha.
Joined the Army in March of 1968. The Army let me get into the warrant officer program and become a helicopter pilot.
I served in the United States Army from 1967 to 1993. I was a commissioned officer of armor and cavalry. I flew Scout helicopters, Cobra helicopters, and Huey helicopters in Vietnam.
We were almost indispensable to what was going on in this jungle environment.
Yeah, we were kind of the wild bunch of Vietnam.
In the 60s, of course, the biggest enemy was the Soviet Union. And the biggest theater for fighting the Soviet Union was Germany. Vietnam was completely different. Military, from what I've read and learned, made a decision to not supplement equal numbers of armored vehicles in Europe to what the Soviets had, that they were going to use helicopters. And Vietnam was the proving grounds because they were thinking of future national defense.
In the mid-60s, the Army ran a competitive process to develop a new Scout helicopter for the Army. Participants were Bell, Hiller, and Hughes, directly related to Howard Hughes. The winner was the OH-6, hand down. It set 23 world records during the competitive process of becoming the Army's light observation helicopter. It was a 4-person aircraft, was extremely agile to maneuver on the ground 4 to 6 feet above the highest obstacle and to do it while under fire with drastic movements, turn on a dime and give you 9 cents back. The OH-6 was built around what was called a truss A-frame, and if the aircraft would have a catastrophic crash, it was prone to shed the landing gear on all 4 points. It would shed the tail, it would shed the rotor blades, and it would essentially roll up into a ball. But that truss A-frame protected the crew chief in the back and the pilot in the front. I've come home with as many as 25 or 30 rounds in the aircraft. I've come home with a 50 caliber round through the compressor, which should have failed. It flew. At 300 hours, it was set to go through intermediate maintenance. Never in either of my tours and scouts did any of my aircraft make it to 300 hours. There was a field full of brand new Cobras, Hueys, Chinooks, and OH-6s, and we didn't have time to repair them. We simply replaced them with brand new aircraft. I've gone down 15 times in an OH-6. It was not made to crash, it was made to survive.
Darts and weaves, and we used to say we'd put it on like a backpack. If it hadn't been for the eggshell construction of the cockpit, I wouldn't be here today, because we hit the ground at about 120 knots and rolled about 3 or 4 times, but the egg shape of the cockpit stayed intact and preserved myself and the 2 gunners flying with me. We crawled out of that before it caught on fire and got rescued.
The survivability was great. Here to prove it. And if we'd have had to fly the Bell instead of the Hughes, every one of the Outcasts probably would have quit because that thing was a POS.
The Draft Lottery, A live report on tonight's picking of the birth dates for the draft.
Tonight, for the first time in 27 years, the United States has again started a draft lottery. And the famous first pick tonight is September 14th.
I got a knock on the door, said, Uncle Sam needs you, boy. So I got drafted. 3 weeks into the draft at basic training in Fort Leonard Wood, I decided to go RA and go to OCS. They said, who wants to go to Rotary Wing Flight School? And I said, sign me up. I'd never thought about flying before that, but I figured that was better than being a forward observer in Vietnam.
Rather than get drafted, I decided to enlist. Hoped to maybe get to fly some fixed wing in the Army, but they had very, very few fixed wing machines, so that never happened. The Army has what they call a dream sheet at the end of your training, where you ask for what you want, and then they give you what they need. I asked for Chinook School and Alaska. They wound up giving me Cobra School and straight to Vietnam.
Back then, you could join, and if you qualified, you could pick an MOS. So I picked the aviation MOS because my dad was an aviator. Did basic at Fort Polk, Louisiana. That confirmed that I didn't want to walk.
Fall of '67, had no direction, had no idea what I was going to do. And one evening, some friends of mine, while playing pool and drinking too much alcohol, decided that we would beat the draft and enlist under the buddy system. Started basic training, and amazingly, I loved it. Took a while for them to explain to me what OCS was, and the XO was very instrumental in saying the pay was better. And then I went down, took the physical for helicopter flight school, and shortly thereafter went to Vietnam.
I was an older soldier. I was 23. I had received a draft notice, and they decided that they weren't going to draft me because of my age. After some self-inflection, I decided to join. I was going to join the Air Force to fly jets. When I went down, they said I needed a college degree. I didn't have one. But they said, why don't you go down and talk to the Army? They need helicopter pilots. 30 minutes later, I had signed up the Warrant Officer Helicopter Program for the Army.
I don't know what my draft number was. It was 1969. Part of my life where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I thought maybe enlisting in the Army and serving my country would give me some maturity and perspective on life. Went to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. We were on a 2-week deployment in the swamps. It was miserable. And one of our guys got hurt, and this helicopter came in, picked him up and took him to the hospital. And I looked at that helicopter flying and said, what am I down here in the swamp for when I could be up there?
I graduated from high school in Del Rio, Texas. Graduated on a Friday, and on Monday I enlisted in the military. I was commissioned an officer in the United States Army and was going to be an infantry officer and was on my way over to Vietnam. But during that time, they announced that if anybody wanted to go take the FAST test, which was a test to determine if you could go to flight school or not, well, it was raining, it was sleety, and we were out there, and I said, well, I don't know anything about that, but I'll certainly, if that's what it takes me to get out of this wet field, I'll go do that. Off I went to Fort Walters, Texas, where I learned to fly a helicopter.
It is 20 hours and 12,000 miles to war, to Benoit Air Base near Saigon. All these men are in the Army. Some are draftees, some regulars.
I'll never forget coming in on the airliner, 17 hours or something across the Pacific, and we're descending into Saigon. And an F-4 Phantom flew right underneath us, and I went, okay, this is for real.
Landed in Vietnam, the heat was almost observable. As they opened the doors in the airplane, you could almost see the wave of heat coming through the aircraft.
I arrived in Vietnam after a 30-day leave on the 1st of January, 1969. My heart was set on going to the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, commanded by George Patton at the time, the son of the World War II Patton. And after the first day in the replacement station, some guys got orders to go off to the 11th ACR, and I'm still sitting there. And then I said, well, if I can't go to the 11th, I'll go to the 1st Cav Division. And after a day or so of guys leaving for the 1st Cav, I'm still sitting there with no unit assignment. And on the third day, I went out and looked at the board that had ultimate assignments on it, and I was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red 1. And I thought, I'm a cavalry officer, what in the heck am I gonna do in an infantry division? My introduction to the 1st Division was told to me by the Charger Quarters, who came to get me, and he said, sir, your ride is here to go to the Big Red. And I went outside, and there was a dump truck sitting there with dirty laundry in it. And the Spec 4 said, just get in the back. And that was my introduction to the 1st Infantry Division. Sent forward to the airfield at Fouloy. The personnel officer said, Lieutenant Mills, you're a cavalry officer. We're gonna send you across the runway to the Air Cavalry Troop of the 4th Cavalry. And I thought, terrific, that's exactly what I want to do. And I went to become Dark Horse 1-6, or the platoon leader of the scout platoon.
Hello, I'm Lieutenant Jim Joyola, and I'm your host on this issue of your Army Reports. Today's program tells the story of new and interesting developments and tactical uses of the helicopter.
The Aviation Scout was the Vietnam equivalent of the Indian Scouts of the Indian Wars. We were man trackers. We flew in what was called hunter-killer teams. The hunter was the Loach and the killer was the Cobra. The scout platoon was a totally volunteer unit. No one was forced to fly scouts. It was an extremely dangerous occupation. The aviator of the time ranged from 19 to 22 years of age. They were, for the very most part, single. And when you've got a 19-year-old single pilot who also believes himself to be invisible and bulletproof, that's what you want in a scout pilot. You don't want anybody that's going to be timid. If you were timid, you made mistakes. If you made mistakes, you got killed.
When you're 19, 20 years old, you're bulletproof. So nobody's really thinking much about the real dangers that we're about to face. At least I wasn't. They wound up sending me to D Troop, 1st and 4th Cavalry at Fouloy. When I got there, my friend Larry Kaufman here and I were both in country at the same day, going through the same processing center, and wound up at Fouloy together as hooch mates.
Let them know right away I wanted to be in a combat unit, a Dark Horse, as a platoon leader and air mission commander. I had a door gunner assigned to me, and fortunately I'm from Texas and he was from Texas, and we hit it off right off, and this is my door gunner here.
When I got to Vietnam, I spent maybe 30 minutes in Benoit. Some E6 grabbed me up and said, you're going to 1st Division, serve in an OH-6 in Division Artillery. I got sideways with a captain up there, and by popular demand, he sent me down to D Troop, 1st Squadron, 4th Cab, and that was the best thing anybody could have ever done to me, because all the D Troopers were great combat soldiers. We just weren't real good garrison soldiers. We kind of had a tendency to push the limit, so to speak. It was a lot of hold my beer and watch this.
Yeah. D Troop was considered elite unit. I was assigned to the lift platoon, which was the 4 horsemen at Fort Huey's. We had the mission of inserting the aerial rifle platoon when it was needed.
Mark that area real good, and you talk to him before you leave station so that you know exactly where I want you to search.
That wasn't something we got trained on in the States. The tactics weren't taught in the States. You learned the helicopter itself. You learned the weaponry itself. You got to practice shooting and hitting targets. Our unit was a CAV unit, consisted of the gun platoon, which was the Cobras, the scout platoon, which was the observers, the hunters, really. Then the aerial rifle platoon, which was infantry, transported by the Hueys. That was new technique in the Vietnam War.
The 4th platoon was unique to the Army in that as an aviation unit, we had our own rifle platoon, organic to our troop.
There's 7 of them down here now, but they keep running in hooches, and I don't want to blow all these hooches away, so I recommend that you probably need more than a squad to search this out. There's quite a few of them all over this area.
The scouts would find the target, the Cobras would address and service the target and protect the scouts.
Okay, 3-1, we got no. You ready to go? Right then, put it on him. Don't hit any women or children or anything, but put it on him.
And then once we had an enemy location fixed, then we could insert the ARPs onto the ground to exploit the reconnaissance by ground means. They also served the wonderful purpose of going in and picking up downed aviators. If we lost an aircraft, we could put 28 riflemen right on top of you at the drop of a hat.
The ARPs were basically infantry that were airlifted in and out by the slicks. The ARPs also had, about a half a dozen group of people which were called Kit Carson Scouts, which were basically North Vietnamese who had come over to the good side, become Army Republic of Vietnam soldiers, and worked with us as part of our Kit Carson Scouts.
The mission was based on need. If one of our helicopters went down, the 4 horsemen would insert the aerial rifle platoon, drop them off. They would fly to a fire support base. At the fire support base, we would wait for further instructions as to what we needed to do. If we needed to fly in more troops, which several times we had to do. If not, they would secure the area, and then later in the day, we would pick them up.
Ken and I's job was to go out in early mornings and find them and engage them, get us in contact as much as possible. Many times while I was in the area, I'd let Ken fly the helicopter. Something happened to me, the only other person in that aircraft that can fly is the door gunner. So
what I always liked about Rod is he realized that there were 2 people in that ship. It was kind of a democratic joint process because he had to fly the aircraft and keep a good eye on what was going on. And all I had to do was look and shoot. Rod showed up, had been there a couple of months, so I was an old guy, and you're always skeptical about a new pilot because they have a tendency to not grasp exactly everything that's going on. Sometimes they hit stuff that was not in the program, right? Run into trees and that kind of thing, until you kind of formed that cohesive unit that we thought the same way, we acted the same way. I knew what he was going to do, he knew what I was going to do. We developed into a pretty lethal team, so to speak.
we became very good at finding the enemy and killing them.
A lot of Vietnam was covered with triple canopy jungle. Very difficult to see down through it or see 10 feet in front of it. We acquired tremendous amounts of information that the ground troops couldn't acquire simply because they couldn't see very much because of the dense foliage. We were almost indispensable to what was going on in this jungle environment. Quite often, because we had such an advantage over the ground troops, we were given an awful lot of authority. And I can remember one day the ADC was on site. There was heavy activity and contact going on the ground. The general was giving the information or telling the ground troops what to do, but he had to leave to refuel. But while he was gone, Dark Horse 3-4, who was me, was in charge. And there was a long period of silence. And a few disgruntled, yes, sir, or Roger.
Why don't you go ahead and you got the lowest fuel, go into Benelux, take on about 300 pounds, and then come back and relieve me. I'm down to 250 now. I can stay on station 5 minutes.
We flew a rotation. I mean, the machine wouldn't stay in the air but a couple of hours. So we would fly until it became time for us to depart station and go refuel and rearm if need be. And we'd refuel with it still running. And somebody would come up and relieve us. So there was never a time when the guys were exposed without any kind of air cover.
This 8-6, I have to go down for fuel. Please mark that area and make sure that 2-6 recognizes where it's at from your marker, over.
If you're going at 60 knots, you can't see anything, you've got to constantly turn. The experienced scout will say, wow, did you see that? I didn't see anything. You would see more at faster speeds. Speed is life to a combat pilot. You slow down or you make multiple turns back into a target, especially in the same direction or axis, you're going to get popped. We flew at 4 to 6 feet off the ground. Cobra flew at about 1,500 feet. I flew in concentric right-hand orbits because I was on the right-hand side of the aircraft. my gunner directly behind me in the rear. And the Cobra flew in left-hand orbits with the front seat marking on a map the audio clues that I was giving him about foot traffic and construction and bunkers.
They've got out there in the field. They came out of this village as soon as we started checking it out. I'm sure they're aware that there's going to be a little action here.
The real value of it was I believe, the Cobra and the firepower of the Cobra. It was the game changer, I think.
The Cobra unleashes rockets and showers of flechettes, thousands of tiny nails.
The front seat guy in the Cobra is the gunner. The back seat guy is the aircraft commander, and he controls the rockets, and he can control the weapons in the turret, but only straight. He can't swivel the turret. The front seat gunner co-pilot can swivel the turret, had his own sight, and he could select whichever weapon he wanted out of that turret. Our major function as a front seat gunner was to monitor the location of the loach at all times.
The last minigun's working now, though. Okay, we'll make a run right after Cobra.
The scout would detect something. If, of course, they would take fire, the first thing out of your mouth was inbound hot. You would be firing immediately.
632, so I got your mark. I'm inbound hot. White Vernon, roll to the right. I'll go hard. Okay, which way? Roll out. Okay, 3-1, we got one. That's correct.
We carried a 1,500 round box magazine, 3,000 rounds of 7.62 linked with the M60 in the back seat, along with multiples of smoke grenades, concussion grenades, frag grenades, white phosphorus grenades, thermite, and Willie Pete. We would drop them from the aircraft. If I had a target I wanted the Cobra to shoot at, I would tell the gunner in the back, I'd say, get red smoke. And he'd take a red smoke off this line that we had strung on the back of the bulkhead, pull the pin, and hold it out the door. I'd then turn inbound to the target. I would say, now, and he would drop it straight down. Forward momentum would take that smoke into the target I wanted to hit. And then I'd break out until the Cobra pilot hit the smoke.
Okay, Clark, I want you to get a Pete, and when I say throw, I want you to throw it exactly when I say throw. I'm going to drop in there, see if I can got it.
I had a brand new crew chief, and I will never forget it. I said, get me a Pete. He pulled the Willie Pete out, pulled the pin, and stuck it out the door. I looked over my shoulder, I identified a Willie Pete. I turned inbound on the target.
Throw straight down, don't throw it sideways, throw it straight down.
And I said, now, and he threw it up. And when he threw it up, it hit the rotor plane and bounced. And I looked out the door, and I'm now flying formation with a Willie Pete grenade that's like right outside my door. And I hit the left cyclic extremely hard, turned it over on its side near, and the Willie Pete blew up. He darn near blew us out of the air. An accident. He was new, he was excited.
Oh, there's a guy down there in that hooch, one right on the door.
Most of the time when we encountered the enemy, they weren't in holes, so they were physically out moving around. Because of the altitude that we flew and the extremely quiet nature of the OH-6, we were quite often on top of them before they ever knew we were there. You're looking in a jungle environment for glint. The jungle does not glint. The jungle doesn't move. Faces glint. You're looking for right angles or unusual angles that don't necessarily appear in nature. Bunkers have corners. We tracked footprints. We could tell 24 to 48 hours whether they were old or new, burning cigarette butts. You knew they were close if the cigarette butt was still burning by smell. Vietnamese soldiers ate a lot of fish, a lot of rice. The urine concentrations and sulfa concentrations, and basically the lack of hygiene for soldiers that live in the bush.
I think there's a tunnel complex under this too. I see a lot of openings in the ground.
I remember flying over those scout pilots, and they would say, back there at that yellow smoke, I saw footprints for 19 people going in a southerly direction 30 minutes ago. One day I approached Lieutenant Mills. I said, how in the heck, looking through all that jungle, can you tell me that there was 19 people or 20 people 30 minutes ago going that direction? And he said, well, it's easy, because we're not looking for anything, we're just looking at what's not supposed to be there. And I thought, man, those guys are so smart, I can't believe it.
Hey, I got another one. Okay, out there at 9 o'clock. He's right there in front of you, 2 o'clock low. Down there by the dike. See him down there? Right here. Right there he is. 2 o'clock low. Shoot him. a minute, shoot him. I ain't got no ammo.
We flew every day, 7 days a week over there, and the missions, lasted, 8, 10, 12 hours. I think I flew like 1,800 hours in my time in Vietnam. I never thought I was going to get hurt. I don't think you'd still do that if you thought you were going to get, shot and hurt seriously. I came around this trail, around this big group of trees, and all of a sudden the stench was so overpowering. I said, oh Christ, we're right in the middle of a bunch of them. Quickly accelerated to about 120 knots, and then the engine blew up because they hit it, and we tumbled, and everything is in slow motion. You probably heard people say that it just went so slow. Well, there's one tumble, there's another one, there goes the skids, there goes the tail boom, there goes the rotor head, and it keeps tumbling to a rest upside down. And so I released my seatbelt and fell to the top of the helicopter, which was now the bottom, and crawled out, and my 2 gunners were hurt, pulled them out, and then the CNC gunship was just right above me, and he landed, and we picked ourselves up and got in there and got out of there in a hurry. But I was in the hospital for about a week after that with some back problems because of compression of the spine. When I got out of there, I kept flying, but I was scared shitless mostly after that.
In the later years of the Vietnam War, helicopter missions became especially dangerous. The enemy's anti-aircraft fire was improving, and helicopters were vulnerable birds. The men who flew them were something special.
We were on a last light mission. The Cobra said, come up to altitude because we were headed home. And I looked out about 2 o'clock, and about 600-700 yards, you could see this thin trail of smoke. And I said, smoke, 2 o'clock. So Rod just peels over there. As we came by, there was 4 NVA around a little campfire. I turned my 60 on. One of them fell into the fire. One of them went backwards. And they all had AKs between their legs, right? Another one started to run. I got him, but one guy got away. And we told the Cobra that we had made contact. And he said, doesn't matter, come up to altitude. So we went up and went home. The next morning, because we knew where they were, they sent us back out.
Following morning when we got there was a hell of a lot more of them waiting for us. Fire was coming from everywhere. We could see one bunker area that Ken was putting M60 ammo into. And while we were trying to stabilize our aircraft where we could shoot successfully into there, we took fire and we went down. We hit the ground, crawled out of the aircraft.
There's 2 ARPs killed, just right off.
An aircraft came down, and I'm not sure who it was, but somebody came down and picked us up. Several other people orbiting above. Their decision was that them to bring helicopters out to us because we knew where the enemy were, and the ARPs were pinned down. And it was going to be very hard to try to move them guys around without knowing exactly where they were. They brought a helicopter in. We picked up that helicopter and went back into the contact area. We were starting to move some tanks from another unit. We were coming up from another direction. And it looked like that about the only way we were going to be able to get them out was by tanks because it was just heavy fire all over the place.
They had armor on the way, but armor was quite a distance off. So what they did was they inserted a company element. You remember that? Yeah. And that company element got pinned down just almost automatically. Yeah. Once they got pinned down, they scrambled that armor. I got a case of smoke grenades because we had talked it over and thinking that maybe if we dumped out enough smoke and the visibility was cut, that the ARPs could get their wounded and pull back. We were in the process of dumping that load of smoke out. We got shot down the second time.
Control tore the tail boom up and went through the engine. So they brought us a third helicopter, and that's the one we went back in. And we were so entrenched in getting the ARPs out of there. These are guys that, who risked their lives on numerous occasions to pick up down scout pods. We were going to do everything we could to get them out of that location. And the fire was continuing to get higher and higher because there was more of the enemy in the back and they were pulling them forward. So on the third time we got shot down, it wasn't from the same location. It was from the reinforcements that were coming from the enemy front. After an all-day battle and getting the tanks in, we finally were able to pull the ARPs out. But we did lose 3 helicopters, but Ken and I did live to tell the story. So the sad part was there were only 3 helicopters lost that day, and they were all 3 of ours. Hugh Mills would walk back in and say, "You're gonna lose every aircraft we got, so,
Rod, one more aircraft, and you'll be an NVA ace.
In one particular mission, which is in the chapter of the book called Hot Dogging It, we were flying from point A to point B to prepare for a mission, and I didn't want to fly at altitude, and so I just stayed low level the whole way. And the Cobra pilots put up with my foolishness on occasion, and we were simply hot dogging it over the tree lines. I'd hit a tree line and I'd pop up and dump the nose and go back down to the ground. As I popped over one of the tree lines and rolled the nose over, and right in front of me, spread across an open field, was a 28-man North Vietnamese heavy weapons platoon. They had tripod-mounted machine guns, they had mortars, they had rifles and squad machine guns. Just left the cover of the jungle and were crossing in column. As the nose came down, I hit the minigun to 4,000 rounds a minute and kicked left pedal and skewed the minigun right across that line of guys. They were running in every direction, and in a turning battle, which would go for another 4 or 5 minutes, and as I passed over the column and did a hard right-hand turn, I noticed that a guy was running down the trail away from me, and he had a huge metal pot on his back, a rice pot. Hit the minigun and rolled him and 3 or 4 other guys. The Cobra is yelling on the radio, "Get out of there, 1-6, get out of there." They wanted to work. And my theory has always been, as long as I could control the fight, I'm not rolling out. Knocked out 28 enemy soldiers in about a minute. It's the most aggressive, active turning fight I was ever in 3 tours.
It was a standard routine recon mission day. Myself and Captain Mike Woods were in the Cobra. I was a front seater. He was the aircraft commander. So I already told you what my job is, right? Keep my eyeballs on that loach all the time. We were searching in a far northwest sector of RAO where there was really nothing. But we were searching for what was purported to be an underground NVA hospital with like 400 beds. It was up near, as I recall, a mountain called Nui Ba Ra. And Bill Jones was the scout pilot, and his crew chief was Potter. I'm looking at the loach, and without any communication at all, it started spinning out of control and crashed and exploded. Didn't give any sound, no radio call, no nothing. My gut reaction was to ask Mike Woods to land the helicopter and let me out so that I could go see if anybody survived. I left the helicopter, and Mike was supposed to go up and give me gun cover while I went into the woods. I had a .38 with 6 rounds, snub nose. That was it. Stupid, brave, I don't know. The first thing I'll tell you is I'm not a hero. I started out charging off through the elephant grass, which is about 7 or 8 feet tall, and I'm into basically a forest canopy floor towards a crash site, which I could see smoke, burning, fire, and I could hear the rounds cooking off from the fire. And I'm hollering out for Bill Jones or anybody to see if I get any response. I didn't hear a thing. I got my weapon up like this in case I saw anything move. As I'm running, suddenly I hear a voice from behind me. I didn't like that. I turned around and brought my weapon down and realized it was Mike Woods, who had left the helicopter running in the grass and had come after me with his weapon to help me. It was just the 2 of us out here now in the woods, and we didn't have much for weapons. But we kept going, and sure enough, we found Bill Jones. He had gotten out of the helicopter. He was burned. He was leaning up against a tree. We rendered first aid as best we could. Of course, he's in shock. Potter died in the crash. Turns out, Mike had been able to make contact with an Air Force forward air controller that was coming on scene, and he also coordinated a rescue Chinook, and they were going to hoist Jones out, but he couldn't hold on to the jungle penetrator. So I rode the jungle penetrator with Jones up into the Chinook and then off to Cu Chi to an immediate emergency hospital. I don't know what happened for sure after that, except that our unit did arrive. They put the ARPs in, they secured the area, and they picked up the remains of Potter. That action I got the one medal that I'm really proud of. And he did too. We got a Bronze Star with V that is only given for ground combat action. Helicopter pilots don't get it. That's my story.
I usually flew in the second aircraft. I was a warrant officer. It was pretty much the same guys. We had the same lieutenant who was the leader of the ARPs. He would go into the lead aircraft. He would be the first on the ground. He would lead our four horsemen into these LZs. Some of the LZs you would go in one at a time. Some of them we'd go in all four together. There was one instance where we went in all four together, and it wasn't a good result. The first aircraft landed, it was on the side of a river, the T10 River, landed on a booby trap grenade or mine, and it blew up. The second ship got hit with the shrapnel. I was in the third ship. The fourth ship started to exit the LZ and thought it was an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade. He flew through the trees and damaged his rotor blades. The door gunner fell out, and he had been mortally wounded, and we saw him fall into the river. So our ship was the only ship that had no damage. We went back in, we picked up our wounded. There were probably 10 of them, so we flew out as many as we could. We went in 4 times to take out the wounded. On the 4th time to go into the area, we wanted to get a dying soldier out of there. We found him, he was in the water. He obviously, to me, he was obviously dead. We had to lower our Huey into the water to the water level because the body was too heavy to pull into the bay of the helicopter unless we did that. Proceeded to come to a hover and take off because we were sure that there might be another booby trap waiting for us. And we lost RPM, which you need 6,600 RPM to fly. So we went down to 6,000 RPM, but we had to go back through the booby-trapped area because the bottom of our Huey was full of water. We drained water as we flew out. We were able to get our RPM back up and then, take the dead soldier into the hospital area where they would take care of him. That's just a vagary of war, I guess.
This young man, on a day in Vietnam, came to my rescue. Dean Siner and I were in the Cobra. We got shot down because we were going low level back towards Phu Loy. And all of a sudden, Mills was taking the lead, and all of a sudden he said, break right, break right. And he saw some ground troops down there, and I looked down and I saw Viet Cong raise his AK-47, and then I heard, and I knew we'd been hit. I heard, whoop, 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 whoop. Gauges were going this way, and Dino said, I'm setting it down. We got out of the helicopter, and I looked over at it, and I saw fluid running all down the side of it, and I had seen those things burn before, and I said, we got to get out of here, Dino. So we took off running, ran about 100 meters. We ended up running and getting in tall elephant grass. We finally came to a stopping point and stopped. In the meantime, he had called for gun support. He said, I need anti-Dark Horse aircraft. Tell what you heard, because you were on the other end of what you heard.
I was flying another mission, another team. Hugh Mills had called to anybody in the area that they needed help. Went racing towards Hugh Mills and Larry Kaufman, probably about 5 to 10 minutes away from their location. The NVA is getting closer to Steen and Larry, and I could pick up Hugh's aircraft bobbing up and down in the distance over the hedge line. As I got close enough, I popped up, pick him up, I'm in down hot. Shot the hell out of the area, and I saw where Dean and Larry were. And I saw all of the Viet Cong, basically separated them from these guys.
He did. When those rockets came out of those rocket pods and I'm on the ground, that was like a jet engine coming out. I mean, it was really loud. And then when they blew up, it was really louder. And I probably came 2 feet off the ground when I heard that thing because it scared me that bad. Mills came in to pick us up. We got in the aircraft. Well, it was marshy right there. It was, as Vietnam was, rice paddies. When Dean and I climbed in, the skids went down like that and spread out, so they're in the mud down underneath. And Hugh tried to pull up, and he could not get that little bird out of that mud. He said, throw out all the ammo. Scout pilot started tossing out all the ammo. As a side effect, I lost my pistol. All of a sudden, Hugh kept rocking back and forth, pulling power, pulling pitch, pulling power. And all of a sudden, we shot up and went about 50 feet straight up in the air. Just when we landed, the Bell Tech rep came out, and Hugh said, you need to take a look at the helicopter because I don't think it's any good anymore. He went over and took one look at it, and he said, how did you get here? And Hugh said, well, we flew that thing here. And he said, no, you didn't fly. That thing won't fly. And it was burnt to a crisp. Everything was melted on it. It had overheated, over-torqued, everything. The ARC platoon leader told me later, it took them 4 hours to go from where they picked us up back to the helicopter. I said, why did it take you 4 hours? It couldn't have been more than 100 meters. He said there were so many mines and booby traps that we had to use our bayonets and dig into the ground to see where the mines were. We ran through it in 30 seconds. And Hugh said, I landed in it. So there might have been a little divine protection there, Paul. And this young man, if he hadn't have been there, I probably wouldn't be here today.
We welcome some of our newbies into our fellowship here. We'll start out by singing them a little song. Oh, you're going home in a body bag, do-da. You're going home in a body bag, oh, do-da-day.
Sometimes when you came in, the only thing you wanted to do was go get drunk. I mean, that was the way we coped. And the Outcasts hooch was known as the party hooch. Everybody showed up there to drink and raise Cain. I went to a veterans thing, and I got taken upstairs to meet the general. He said, what do you think about this thing in the sandbox? And I said, General, as an old air cab trooper, I said, I think it's un-American to fight a war without booze. And he looked at me and kind of went, okay, I'll take a notation of that. The officers, they stayed over there on their turf because I think the rest of the troop was kind of afraid of us. At one of the reunions, a mail clerk came. We were all camped around the table, the Outcast platoon, and he said, you don't remember me, do you? And you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, right? I go, you look familiar, but I can't place the name. And he said, well, I was the mail clerk. And he said, when I came into the troop, the first sergeant took me out and pointed to y'all's hooch and said, that's the Outcasts, don't go down there. He said, I never went down there. I gave your mail to your platoon sergeant. I never, they overlooked a lot. And I feel sorry for today's Army because we probably set an extremely bad example, and that's why the new regulations are so strict.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. I believe that one of the reasons for the deep division about Vietnam is that many Americans have lost confidence in what their government has told them about our policy.
I'll tell you this, for most of us Vietnam vets, we didn't get a real good welcome home.
Gotten out of the Army and was transported back, and I landed at San Francisco. I was aware that it was a controversial war, but I wasn't aware how much hatred was out there. And so I tried to hitchhike in my uniform into San Francisco proper, and I had a guy throw a cup of coffee on me. He said, you need a ride? And he rolled down the window. I said, yeah. And so he throws coffee on me, and he said, you know. So I thought, well, what was that all about? You know, I was just doing my job. PTSD jumped in there at about that time. I was wandering. I didn't know what to do. I spent about 9 months. I had bought a car, just kind of traveled around the West, sleeping in parks and staying with some friends because I didn't know what to do. I was having a lot of flashbacks and bad dreams and sweating. And I didn't realize the impact of the brutality of war on my emotional development. And so I had a hard time dealing with the death and destruction that I witnessed over there and took part in. And at the time I thought, you know, I'm doing what my country's asked me to do, you know. And I didn't disagree with going over there, but those people were dishonest, they lied, they were cavalier about how many casualties are we gonna have this weekend. I've heard tapes of LBJ and McNamara saying, how many casualties are we gonna suffer this week? Oh, yeah, it's only gonna be 2,500. Oh, just only 2,500. Oh gosh, that's great. Well, okay, let's send them into harm's way. It just totally pisses me off that they were so reckless with the loyalty of the servicemen that were over there. You know, we shouldn't have been there. It was a mistake, in my opinion, to be there. there. We weren't serving any purpose. You know, there wasn't a strategic objective. You know, it's just how many people can you kill? So my political views have changed on that. We need to be a lot more careful strategically when we get involved in foreign affairs. We've got to make sure that our strategic interests are at stake. Because we can't fight every little battle in the world and try and save humanity. That's not going to work. Because when you send men into harm's way, you're sending people that are going to die. And you better be careful that you're doing the right thing. And we weren't doing the right thing in Vietnam, in my opinion. Thanks for the opportunity to present my story.
Over 842 OH-6s were shot down and lost. 4,000 plus aviation crew members were killed in Vietnam. We had a casualty rate, people hurt, at a rate of about 80%. All of the pilots killed in 1969 were scout pilots. Paul Fishman probably saved my life along with Larry Kaufman. I'm alive today because of scout crew chiefs who were very good with their M60 and Cobra pilots who were very good with rockets.
One day I was driving through Sulphur Springs, Texas, and I saw an Apache helicopter at the Sulphur Springs airport. And I said, what is an Apache doing here? So I turned around and went back. The young captain standing out there, I said, do you mind if I take a look inside the cockpit? And he said, well, yeah, I guess so. For what reason? Why would you want to look in the cockpit? I said, well, I flew Cobras in Vietnam, and I just wanted to kind of see how much are they alike. He said, oh, man. He said, did you fly 100 killer teams? I said, yes. You can climb in that thing if you want to. Go ahead, just have a seat. He said, we studied you guys. You're our heroes. Well, I had never contemplated that, Paul, that we were somebody's heroes and that they studied our tactics.
What we had learned in Vietnam and learned flying low, fighting an enemy force, helped us to begin the present-day utilization of helicopters on the world stage. The Apache is the end result of what Cobras did.
The Scout pilot of Vietnam evolved into the Night Stalker of today. And we are extremely proud of that. These guys have kept the legend of the OH-6, the little bird, alive. The guys that gravitate to the Night Stalkers are the guys who would have been scout pilots.
I personally didn't have a lot of need to keep living in Vietnam. So I didn't go to any reunions, even when they started having them early on. It was probably 25 years at least, maybe more than that, before I got a call from one of the guys, Larry Kaufman, and he said the daughter of one of my mentors and guys in our unit, a fellow named Joe Vad, who died on his last day in country. His daughter was now a grown woman and was coming into town and wanted to meet up with some people who knew her father. So I thought, well, that's okay. I'll go do that. And I found out it was pretty fun seeing them.
The bond is such that 50 years later, we still talk to each other routinely. We still have reunions, we have get-togethers.
I bond with Hugh Mills. We've been together as best friends. I live less than a block and a half from him now for over 30 years. You know, I think I was 19 when this all started, but it's something that I would never trade for anything else. Got friendships that'll go for a lifetime, and got memories that'll last forever.
Even though I was there just for a short time, there was so much going on, there was so much coordination and working together and bonding. It has lasted 53 years. You know, I left there in 1970, and I'm visiting friends that I made in that time today. We brag on our grandkids and children and their accomplishments, and mostly we're just thankful.
You don't really know a person until a life or death thing is presented to you, and it's amazing, you know, the quality of the American soldier and all of D Troop. That was my privilege in life to have served in D Troop, because every one of those guys would have gone to the limit to help you out.
So it's a very, very good friendship that has lasted almost 2-3/4 of our lives.
So I'm a recreational pilot these days, but I can tell you that my days as a scout pilot are the most formative portion of my military career. I was as close to being immortal as I was ever going to be. I saw the most action I would ever see as a scout pilot. And the thing I'm most proud of, if you look at the memorial page in the early pages of the book, you'll see the names of the guys that died with us. Very few people in the Scouts got any kind of recognition. It's a very small number of people. When you consider there's only 10 Scout pilots in the unit of 150 people. It was an opportunity to tell the story of the Scout pilot in Vietnam. That is a trade that's gone today. It's completely gone. The Army has no Scout capability. But it was the formative assignment in my career, and as far as I'm concerned, it laid the foundation for me as a human being.
Like most military guys, if you serve close, you are a literal band of brothers. And there's nothing that we wouldn't do for each other.
You should ask Rod Willis about the day that the reporter from CBS came to our unit and wanted to fly in the Scouts because he didn't know anything about it. He lasted 15 minutes. Begged to get out of the aircraft.
Stars and Stripes reporter with me, and I engaged them with my minigun, and when they did that, they started firing back, and when they started firing back, the Stars and Stripes reporter slid down in his seat because he could see all these things coming back at him, and he was petrified. And we found out after we inserted the ARPs and everything in there to the area to find out what it was. It was a large NVA unit. It was moving a bunch of Vietnam prisoner of war back up to Hanoi. So we were able to free up a lot of Vietnamese soldiers that would have probably died if it hadn't happened. But they never sent me out again with another reporter. So it was a fairly